Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, On-Premise and Cloud Database Replication with Microsoft Azure. I'm Megan Souza, Marketing Manager here with Dunn Solutions Group. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items. Today, we do have a slight change from our usual webinars, as this one was pre-recorded. Today's presenter has a funeral to attend, so for any questions that you may have today, please type those in the chat box as usual, and we'll be happy to follow up with you on those. We also have all previous recordings of webinars on our website in the event that you missed any in the past at dunnsolutions.com. So let's take a look at today's agenda. I will begin by doing introductions to Dunn Solutions Group. From there, I will turn it over to today's presenter, Natasha Kishinevsky, our Analytics Manager here at Dunn Solutions. Natasha will discuss the benefits of using Microsoft Azure, and also why you would move your data into Microsoft Azure, and then she will follow up with a demonstration, after which I will take any questions that you have and we'll follow up with you on those at a later time. So let's begin. Dunn Solutions has a long history of delivering innovative business technology solutions. We are headquartered just outside of Chicago and have offices in Minneapolis, Raleigh, and Bangalore, India. Our offerings fall into two practice areas. Our application development solutions feature portals, e-commerce and content managed websites, mobile application development, and custom application development. Our analytics solutions feature analytics and BI platforms, as well as data warehouse and data integration. We are authorized SAP and Liferay training providers and offer classroom, virtual, private, and custom options. We believe training is important because once we deliver a solution, we want to make sure that those who need it know how to use it and maintain it. Our clients, some of which are listed here, are a combination of Fortune 500 mid-market companies, government agencies, and nonprofits across all verticals. About 80% of our business are commercial clients and 20% is nonprofit and government. We maintain strong partnerships with top technology companies in order to offer our clients the most innovative solutions available today. Our analytics practice helps deliver information to decision makers throughout your organization so that it runs better. We can help with decision making by not only looking in the rearview mirror, but also looking forward into the future by leveraging predictive analytics and data mining techniques. We've built solutions for our customers which help them better manage their sales operations and inventory predictions, even helping determine where to build the next hospital. We make it easy for them to get that information using tools that don't require you to be a programmer, so that analysts and line of business managers can easily access the data that they need to better run the business. We offer a global delivery model that gives us the flexibility to build teams that are best suited to our clients' timelines, budgets, and preferences. Projects that utilize offshore resources are always led by someone local and US-based. Thank you for allowing me to introduce you to Dunn Solutions. I will now hand over the presentation to Natasha.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha Kishinevsky. I'm a manager in our analytics practice, and I've been working in the space of business intelligence and analytics for almost 15 years. I'm very excited about our webinar today, as it will address a topic that is probably a subject of discussion for many organizations. Let's take a look at our agenda. Today, we will talk about Microsoft Azure and how your organization can leverage Azure Platform as a Service. During our webinar, we will review some of the benefits of cloud analytics, and we'll discuss why Azure is one of the best options available. We will provide an overview of some of the Azure data storage techniques. Keep in mind, we will only cover a few of the many types of storage options available. Our demonstration today will focus on SQL Server databases in Azure. We'll work on bringing data into our Azure SQL Server database, and we'll make sure the data stays in sync by taking a look at transactional-based replication process. Your questions from today will be recorded and addressed at a later time. Let's look at some of the benefits of Azure. One of the advantages of having your applications databases in the cloud is the fact that you don't need to worry about infrastructure setup, configuration, and maintenance. Let someone else worry about that while you handle your other strategic objectives. Reduce cost by not having the hardware on-premise. Instead, use the cloud solution to host your data, analytics, and other applications. With cloud-based solutions, you can grow your analytics environment as you see fit. You can use as much or as little of the resources and only pay for what you're using. With a cloud-based deployment, you really only have to pay for the computer processing time, as well as the storage space you need at a given time. No need to worry about support, no need to worry about maintenance and troubleshooting of your web applications, database servers, and other components. This allows you to scale on demand, grow on demand, eliminate on-premise infrastructure and reduce costs, and keep your data secure. This also allows you to access your data anywhere over the internet. So those were the benefits overall of cloud-based analytics. Why choose Azure over other competitors? And we realized that Azure may not be for everyone. However, if your organization relies on Windows as your operating system, transition to Azure will be the next step in the evolution. Azure is based on Windows, which means you can continue leveraging the same programming skills you have used before. You can continue using Visual Basic, C++, .NET Framework, and so on to develop your applications. Same goes for the data storage and analytics. SQL Server databases in Azure have the same underlying architecture as your current SQL Server. It would be your DBAs will be very familiar with the structure and the management features of SQL Server in Azure. Visual Studio can be leveraged to do your development and also to manipulate data in Azure databases. With Azure, the infrastructure is scalable. As your organization or your customer base grows, you can tell Azure to use more processing power for your applications and data storage. You can simply tell Azure how many processors you need at this time. This allows you to respond quickly to changes in your organization, scale quickly up and down. With Azure, you can design a hybrid model. This is a model where you may choose to keep some of your data and applications on-premise while others will reside in the cloud. We will talk more about that later on in our webinar. The other benefit of having Azure is the flexible pricing model. So again, you only have to pay for what you need at the point in time. And as your organization grows and as your needs grow, you will add additional pricing tiers to your cloud-based deployment. All right, so the next step in our presentation is the overview of Azure data storage. We will take a look at a few of the options, and keep in mind that there's a lot more to choose from. So Azure offers different ways of storing data. As a matter of fact, every time I turn around, it seems as though there's a new option available. I have chosen to review 3 of those options: the Azure Storage, SQL Server Database, and SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. Azure Storage is a great solution when dealing with large amounts of data. It provides flexibility when storing and retrieving large amounts of data, including unstructured data. Azure Storage is made up of blobs, tables, and queues. Blobs are used to store unstructured data, such as documents and media files. Table storage is used for structured NoSQL data, and queues are used for storing messages. The Azure SQL Server databases, also known as Platform as a Service database or Database as a Service, relies on the same architecture as your on-premise SQL Server DBMS. And it does offer compatibility with the majority of SQL Server features. Keep in mind, you do have to have the latest version of SQL Server available. It works with compatible SQL Server 2014 databases. Lastly, we have SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. This is where you have a SQL Server installed on an Azure virtual machine, and you're basically responsible for maintaining that virtual machine. It's known as infrastructure as a service deployment model. All right, one of the benefits of Azure we touched on briefly in an earlier slide was the flexibility of Azure when it comes to on-premise, off-premise hybrid model. This allows the organizations to take the time needed to transition into the cloud-based platform. With this model, you can keep some of your critical operational applications and data on-premise while moving some other applications and analytics to the cloud. As you move your applications to the cloud, you lower the cost of hardware and administration resources, as you can see from the diagram below. Keep that in mind when planning your cloud deployment. Now let's talk about options for moving data into your cloud-based databases. Here you can see two approaches that I've selected. Yeah, we'll discuss those two approaches and we'll take a look at those in our demonstration today. One of the options is to use the SQL Server Management Studio migration wizard. The other option is to use backup and restore method. And by the way, you'll need the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio to take advantage of both of these approaches. I have used SQL Server 2014 to test this out, and I will be showing you a demonstration of SQL Server Management Studio deployment wizard in the demonstration later today. The process of deploying the database using SQL Server Management Studio is very straightforward and uses a wizard. The process of backup and restore requires a few more steps, but both approaches are equally intuitive and user-friendly. The deployment method is a straightforward deployment from the on-premise database to the cloud. The backup and restore may be broken down into two paths, one working with the schema, the other one focusing on the data. So let's take a look at why you would choose one versus the other. The backup and restore, or using the backpack file, is the approach that you should take if the data set is too large, or if you have any problems with connectivity to Azure. So if your data set is too large, you may also want to consider this approach. And keep in mind, this will be moving data and schema, so the process may take a while for large sets of data. For very large data sets, consider breaking the backup file into BCP and backpack files. The backpack file would contain the schema, while the BCP file would contain the data. Generating both of these backup files, you'll need to use the export data tier feature in SQL Server Management Studio, as you can see from the screenshot on this slide. The screenshot was actually taken from the SQL Server Management Studio 2014. The SQL Server Management Studio Migration Wizard is a streamlined way of migrating your data into Azure SQL Server database. With this option, you can actually create the new database on the fly using this process, or you can connect to an existing Azure database to import the data into it. It basically creates if you choose to create the database on the fly, it'll use the schema in the generation wizard to create the new database in Azure. To kick off the migration wizard, as you can see from the screenshots in the slide, you'll need to access the Deploy Database to Azure task from All Tasks menu on the database side. Once you have your data deployed to an Azure SQL Server database, you can create a transactional replication process. This will ensure that any changes that occur to the data in your on-premise database will be applied to your cloud-based database almost immediately. The process of setting up this kind of replication is very similar to setting up replication on-premise in an on-premise SQL Server. The publisher will be the on-premise SQL Server, while the subscriber will be Azure database. The distributor will also be the on-premise SQL Server engine. Keep in mind, since we're using SQL Server, we can use SQL Server Management Studio for all these tasks. We can also query our Azure databases directly from the SQL Server Management Studio. There's no need to learn anything new specifically for Azure. let's move on to our demonstration. So the first thing that we're going to do in the demonstration today is we're going to create a new database directly in Azure portal. We'll review the properties of the SQL Server database, and we'll review the pricing for the SQL Server database that we're about to create. So this time I'm going to bring over my browser here. All right, and what you're seeing right now on the screen is my Azure portal. I'm logged in as part of our organization. So if your organization has an Azure account, you can basically have Active Directory logins to the Azure portal. Based on your security privileges, you'll have access to a variety of different resources. I have access to SQL Server databases, other cloud services, data factories, data lake analytics, and so on. I can also create my own SQL servers here, as I've already done in the past. Let's look at all the resources that I have available on my portal. I have one SQL Server that I've created, and I also have a few SQL Server databases that reside under my subscription. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new SQL Server database. I'm going to follow a pretty self-intuitive process. Let's call it Azure Webinar Database. The first thing that I have to specify is the server on which I want that database to reside. And I'm just going to use my existing SQL Server that I've created in the past. But from this point on, I actually could create a new server as well. I'm going to go ahead and select my existing server. And for the database, I can select an existing source. So I can actually create either a blank database, which I will populate later. I can create a sample database, which I believe is the AdventureWorks. I actually didn't want to do that. Let me take a step back here. Or I can choose a backup file to restore from. So that's another option that I can take here. I'm going to just create a blank database for now. Now I have to pick the pricing tier. So just a quick overview of the pricing, and I'm just waiting for the pricing to load here. While it's loading, there's different types of pricing tiers that you can choose from, and most of them really are about the resources and the storage space. So these premium ones are up to 500 gig, and we scale down to 250 gig, and we have the 2 gig basic pricing tier, which is the one that I'm going to choose for the demonstration today. My resource group is basically related to my subscription. So the administrator has rights to change that. I really don't. So this is basically everything that's available for me within the organization. So I'm going to go ahead and create my webinar demo database. This process may actually take a few minutes. So while it's creating the database, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it looks like in SQL Server Management Studio. So right now I have created the connectivity to my Azure SQL Server directly from SQL Server Management Studio. And as a matter of fact, I can actually connect to my on-premise SQL servers from here as well. So I can basically have both of them running side by side, and I can query the data from both the SQL Server databases on-premise, which is this one, and SQL Server databases in Azure. Let me actually refresh to see if that database was created. Here's Azure demo database that I just created, so it's already available for me to start populating with data or manipulating security and things like that. And as you can see, as I'm expanding the features and the components of that database, it looks very similar to our on-premise databases. Let's take a look at our Azure demo database here. All right, so the features, we have the tables, the views, the synonyms, and the other features that are available for us in SQL Server on-premise. Querying the SQL Server databases in Azure is done also through SQL Server Management Studio. Because we have access to it here, we can definitely create queries with that data. So if I were to all right, so this is basically my data that resides in Azure right now, and I was able to query directly from my SQL Server Management Studio. All right, let's go back to the portal, and it looks like our database has successfully been created. So if I look in my SQL Server databases now, I have an additional Azure webinar database here. All right, so how do we actually move the data into an Azure database? The option that I chose for the demonstration is using the deployment wizard, deploying database to a Microsoft Azure virtual machine. We can load the data by using the SQL Server Management Studio, and let's go ahead and review the steps that are required, and we're going to query the database that was created and populated initially. So I'm going to switch over again to my SQL Server Management Studio. And let's switch to my on-premise server, which is my VM SQL 2012. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to deploy this particular database into my Azure storage. So let's look at the tasks here. And one of the tasks is to deploy database to Microsoft Azure SQL database. Keep in mind that when you're doing that, you have to make sure that your security is set up so that you're not using any Active Directory users. And a lot of times what's going to happen is if you have an older version of the database, when you try to deploy to Azure, it will throw compatibility errors. You can find a lot of information, a lot of resources on the web about fixing the compatibility errors when this happens. All right, so let's go ahead and go through the deployment wizard. All right, so what I need to do right now is provide the server connection. So I'm going to connect to my Azure SQL Server. And let's see what my database was called, Azure Webinar DB. That's what I'm going to call it here. All right. Here I also have an option to select the pricing tier if I'm creating a brand new database, which is what I'm doing right now. So it basically gives me a summary of what's going to be populated, and the size of the database cannot grow above 2 gig because that's my pricing tier. All right, so now it's going to go through the process of creating the schema, generating the schema, actually creating a new database in Azure. So this process does take a few minutes. Then what's going to happen is it's going to take the information in these few tables that exist there, and it's going to actually, if I have any indexes, it's going to create the indexes there if required, and also populate all the necessary data into my tables here. All right, while this is taking place here, let's take a look at the next step in our demonstration. All right, so once you move data into your Azure SQL database, you have to ensure that the database on-premise and the database in Azure is kept in sync. So just like in on-premise SQL Server, you create replication process, you can do this with your off-premise databases as well. So let's take a look at the process or the properties of the replication process that I created before. All right, so my on-premise SQL Server has a publication that allows me to keep in sync my AdventureWorks demo database in Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and open up some of the properties here. All right, so everything that you see here is done through the SQL Server Management Studio. You know, you specify the name of the replication, the source database, you specify if the subscription will ever expire. You have a chance to pick the articles that need to be replicated, not necessarily have all the tables be replicated, maybe a few. You can also choose the stored procedures and views to be replicated, as well as user-defined functions. You can also add filters to the tables, and you can choose whether or not to create a snapshot each time you initialize or not. All right. Whenever schema changes are made, this is an important one. If new fields are added to your source database, you want to make sure that that's kept in sync with the Azure database as well. So you want to make sure that the replicate schema changes is set to true. So keep that in mind. All right, and let's take a look at the subscription properties. All right, so the subscription properties are, we basically have our source database, and we have the subscription identifier, which is our Azure SQL Server, our Azure database, and it's a push subscription, so it's pushed from the publisher. All right, so let's see how that works. Right now, my Azure, my AdventureWorks database should be in sync with the on-premise one. So let's actually take a look at that. I'm going to, let's query our customer data, customer table. All right, so for the customer with ID 11,000, the geography key right now is 26. Let's actually make that change. So let's take a look at what do we have in our on-premise version of this table. All right, geography key 26. I'm going to go ahead and update this. And I'm going to update the key for 1101. All right, so it looks like we have two transactions with two commands that were delivered. So we basically updated two records in our database, and those two transactions were delivered to our Azure SQL Server database. So let me close these out so we're not confused with what we're looking at. And I'm going to go to my Azure AdventureWorks database, and let's take a look at our customer. It looks like our updates are already there. So this basically shows you that once you have the transactional-based replication set up in your on-premise environment, your Azure database will be in sync with that, and you'll be able to make sure that your data is as up to date as it is on-premise. It's going to be up to date for your cloud-based analytics. All right, and while we were working with replication, our process of deploying the database into Azure has completed successfully. So now we have that database in Azure that we just created using the deployment wizard. So we saw two options of creating databases in Azure. One of them was just simply creating the database from the portal, which you can then populate using backup files. And we saw an option to create a database using the migration wizard, which will basically generate everything, the schema and the data, and create the database in Azure based on that. And we also saw the properties of transactional-based replication and how that works. Let me switch back to my slides here. And now, kind of a good conclusion to this is how would you use all of this data? How would you use the data in the cloud? One of the things that Microsoft offers is Power BI in the cloud. And let me switch over to my browser here. And one of the things that you can do with Power BI is create dashboards on the fly. So I have these Azure database sources here. Basically, I can get data from this AdventureWorks database that I've just populated. And what I can do here is build a couple of dashboards. So just let's give it a try here. Big cities. Make it a little bigger. And since this is a retailer data set, we'll pick some product sales. Actually, let's look at internet sales here. All right, here we go. All right. Oops. All right, and once you create these dashboards here in Power BI, and obviously I can add additional charts and graphs here, and I can create an interactive dashboard. I can save this and share this with other users, and this can be accessed over the internet using the same security model that's applied to our Azure infrastructure. All right, so just to recap the benefits of using something like Azure for your cloud-based analytics. With Azure, you reduce the infrastructure cost. You reduce the cost of maintenance and administration and hardware. With Azure, it's easy to scale as you need, so you can change the pricing tiers for your data storage. You can change the pricing tier for your applications, for your web applications, and so on. It is easy to use. It's a familiar operating system. It's a familiar database management system. Again, nothing new to learn. I basically was able to accomplish all these tasks just simply using SQL Server Management Studio. So I didn't really have to learn anything specific to Azure. Once I figured out how the subscription process works, everything else was kind of a piece of cake. The hybrid model allows organizations to have a phased approach to cloud deployment. So as we saw in one of my slides there, you can have as many features as you need deployed in the cloud while keeping some of your more critical transactional operational things on premise. And Azure is secure, so you can provide secure access to your data to your customers and your internal users over the internet. So this concludes the webinar today. I wanted to thank everyone for attending, and we will be sure to address any questions that you have submitted during the webinar at a later time.
We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Please feel free to type in any questions you may have, and we will follow up with you on those. I'll wait for a few minutes for you to do so. Otherwise, from the Dunn Solutions team, thank you for joining our webinar today, and have a great rest of your day.